And there's lots of really good ideas, things to say, ways to be, how to shine, how to flavor, that were really interesting. And you know, maybe you're 5, things are really, really good. So then, like any other light, don't hide that. Let it shine to everyone so that everybody can maybe go through an entire month, every single day, with a new way to shine their light before their students. Because there's enough of us here to probably have at least 2 or 3 months covered with each of your ideas. Wouldn't that be amazing? Yeah. To shine your light in different ways, because you know that other people have done it and it's worked really well. So I'm going to leave that for you. Right now I'm going to tell you 2 stories, so you need to bear with me. They do serve a purpose, and I'm fairly certain that they're going to make sense at the end, but we'll see what happens at the end. It was 7 o'clock in the morning when 8 members of my hiking group reached the base of the mountain that we had chosen that day to climb. It was 1998, and I was just about to move to Portugal, so this was going to be our last climb together. In any climb, there are 2 parts that I really dislike: going up and coming down. The rest is awesome. So this climb, the going up, did not start really easily. Within the first kilometer, we were all fighting for breath. And as we slowly made our way up, we were blessed with incredible views of the surrounding mountain range, and we could pick out deer and bear and moose far below us in the valley. And we kept pushing forward for another couple of hours until we finally arrived at our first mountain prairie. And it was absolutely incredible. There were wildflowers of every color you can imagine. And the grass was incredibly green. It looked like nobody had ever been there or touched it, except that there was a winding path all the way through it. And we decided to stop there to have our snack for about 15 minutes before we carried on. There was fog at this level of the mountain, and it was taking a lot longer to burn off than what was normal. And that should have been our first red flag, but it wasn't. So up we went. 4 more hours of hiking, scrambling, resting, encouraging, and groaning. And finally, we were there within 200 meters of the top. And these last 200 meters were going to be really, really challenging because the rock changed. We went from kind of dirt and gravel to a type of rock that is more like a shingle, laying on top of one another. And that meant that as you stepped on them, they would slide against one another and start small rock slides. And besides that, it was really cold. And it's always colder on top of a mountain than it is at the base. But it was oddly cold. We hadn't actually taken off any of the layers of clothes that we had brought, and normally we do. And it was close to noon. The fog was so thick that it actually was making the ground wet. And honestly, we couldn't even see the top of the mountain. It was covered in fog and cloud. Now, common sense and the fact that we had done this several times before should have told us to stop and turn around. But when you have climbed for 6 hours and you are 200 meters from the summit, you're gonna go the 200 meters to get to that summit, because nobody wants to go home and say, well, we almost made it. So we pushed on. We finally made it to the summit without causing any major rock slide. We sat down on the top of the world and we saw nothing. Just clouds and the foggy appearance of each other. I had lunch beside my cousin, who I convinced to come with me on this little adventure. And we joked that where we were sitting could actually be a place where there was absolutely nothing beneath us. And suddenly there was a gust of wind, the clouds cleared, and underneath our feet was a 1,000-meter drop. We had unknowingly sat on the knife edge of a cliff. So while we carefully moved ourselves into a more secure position, we were in awe of the view that we were seeing. I mean, the clouds did clear up a little bit, and we could see some of the mountain range in the Canadian Rockies. And it was incredibly beautiful. And we were mentioning its beauty until we were interrupted by thunder and rain. Now, on top of the mountain in a thunderstorm, that's not where you want to be. So we cut lunch short, and we started to head back down. And as we started to move out, below us, 200 meters, we saw other hikers who were still trying to come up. Summit fever. And we, every step, sent showers of rocks on top of them. So getting down without being hurt or hurting others was going to be difficult. The rocks now were extremely wet and slippery, and it was impossible to know which of these rocks was actually going to hold our weight and which were going to slide from under us. So I had gone down about 50 meters, and I looked around to see how my cousin was doing, and I couldn't see her. I looked behind me in the fog, and finally I caught a glimpse of her, and she was still on the summit where we had had lunch. And I yelled at her to hurry up, because she was so far back, but she didn't move. And I called again, and I saw her put her head down on her knees, and her shoulders started to shake. And I thought, oh, she's crying. So I turned around and I went back up, and I said, Karen, come on, we have to go. We can't stay here. She said, I can't, Connie, I'm too scared. I can't move, I literally cannot move. And I said, as a loving cousin, oh yes you can. You just put one leg here and the other one there and you will move. And she said, I can't, I'm frozen. You go on without me. I could just imagine facing my aunt the next day. So I said, yeah, I'm not gonna leave you up here on the top of the mountain. So here's what we're going to do. I'm gonna go down 2 meters, and then I'm going to brace myself. And you're just gonna let yourself go and slide until you hit into me. And then you brace yourself, I'll go down 50 meters. And you do the same thing. And that's what we did. Every 2 meters, for 200 meters, I would brace myself to be crashed into by my cousin, who was a lightweight, so it wasn't so bad. We finally made it. She was terrified, and I was terribly bruised, but we made it. And by the time we reached the bottom and into our cars, the whole thing actually seemed really quite funny. Well, for us, not for her. And when we got home, we were so excited to tell everyone what had happened. But the story had to wait, as my nephew that very morning was born, and it didn't take very long for that adventure to find its way into the background of daily living and to be pulled out only on special moments like this or when we happen to be talking about mountains, hiking, and rain. I tell you that story because I want to draw a parallel between hiking up a mountain and living as disciples of Jesus Christ. It's something we call missional living. And it's how disciples need to live in a very, very complex world. Missional living happens on the mountaintop, at the base, and everywhere in between. There isn't a place where God doesn't want us to be an integral part of His journey. The question is, do we have faith not only to believe that, but also to live it? So here comes story number 2. This one taught me a lot about missional living, when it's great and encouraging, when it's difficult and discouraging, when it's even mundane and monotonous, and when it's okay and even peaceful. In the first verses of Matthew chapter 17, Jesus plans to go for a hike in the mountains. He decides to travel light, so he only asks his closest friends to come with him, Peter, James, and John. Now I'm guessing the 3 were feeling particularly happy that day, chosen as they were to hang out with Jesus for a while. This would be some real kind of guy time. And Peter was most likely trying to figure out something clever to say, because he was notorious for over-talking. And meanwhile, James and John were probably playing rock, paper, scissors to see who would walk up on Jesus' right hand and who would walk up on Jesus' left hand. But they go up this mountain together. And we're told that the mountain they walked up was a high one. So this journey was going to take a while. So yes, even when hiking with Jesus, to get to the top of the mountain, you have to climb. Climbing up is hard work. It's often dusty, it's hard to breathe, your legs and your lungs hurt. There's usually complaining on the way up. It starts pleasant enough. It's a gentle stroll at the base. But when the steep parts hit, and when Peter's in the group, somebody's going to say something. But the only thing that keeps you going is the goal. You deal with the pain, you deal with the exhaustion, you stop talking and you focus. You're going to get to the top. You want to reach the summit. And that's what Peter, James, and John do. right beside Jesus. And when they get to the top, verse 2 and 3, they're huffing and puffing and sweating like men. Jesus suddenly changes. Now, biblically, we call this the transfiguration. In other words, what happened was that Jesus looked like he looks today, in all of his splendor and glory. And if you want to know what that looks like, read Revelation chapter 1, verse 12 to 16. That's what the transfiguration was. Jesus in that form. I mean, minutes before, Jesus was this 30-something year-old guy who had just hiked up a mountain. Now Jesus looks like God. And then suddenly Moses and Elijah show up. Now Moses is the greatest prophet Israel had and one of their greatest leaders. And Elijah, he was the prophet who would announce the Messiah's rival, the guy who went up into heaven in a chariot of fire. James and John completely freeze up. They have no idea what to say or what to do. But Peter, he just can't stop himself. And he breaks in and offers to build some tents. Now, where he thinks he's going to get material for tent building on top of a mountain, I don't know, but that's Peter. He's very spontaneous. And there are historical and theological reasons for why Peter offered to do what he offered to do. But in any case, it wasn't the timing, and his suggestion was inappropriate at the time. So here we have Jesus as he looks today. We have Moses, who represents the Old Testament covenant and the promise of salvation. We have Elijah, who is the appointed restorer of all things. And in verse 5, God arrives. Thunder, lightning, every mountain story has them. Besides, when God appears, even nature can't contain itself. And God confirms and encourages his son. Finally, something that can even stop Peter from talking. I mean, come on, this is awesome. This is extraordinary. Jesus, Moses, Elijah, God. I mean, when we talk about mountaintop experience, that's nothing compared to what they had. And when the disciples finally come around, verse 8, everything has gone back to normal, and Jesus looks like his 30-something self again. But these guys have been touched and moved, shocked, and are in awe. And all the way down then, they talk about what they had seen and experienced, verse 9. They want to know what happened and why it happened. And Jesus patiently answers them. Going down the mountain is a time for the disciples to debrief, to process what they experienced on the top of that mountain. In the end, Jesus tells his friends not to tell anyone what they saw and experienced. And this might be the biggest miracle of all, because it appears that they actually kept their promise. We actually find out that they did tell their friends after the resurrection. So they did pretty good. But these guys are elated. This has been the most incredible experience of their time of Jesus in discipleship training. So in verse 12, we find our disciples reunited with the rest of the group. They're on solid horizontal ground, and this is where they live. They don't live on the mountain, not going up, not coming down. This is real life. Real life with all of its monotony and problems and temptations and struggles, but also its joys and friendships, families, victories, and life. It's just that this life is really hard when you've just been on top of a mountain. On top of the mountain, the disciples feel really special and privileged and encouraged and strengthened. They must have felt invincible after seeing and experiencing what they did. They were the chosen three. They saw Moses and Elijah and God. So when, in verse 14, they run into a man who has a bit of a spiritual situation, okay, it's a big one, his son is demon-possessed, I'm sure the disciples thought, this is going to be easy. We've got this. We have just hiked up with Jesus, up a mountain and down. We got this. But in the end, we discover they don't have this at all. The disciples had tried to free this young man from the demon, but they can't do it. And so the boy's father comes to the one person he knows he can. And finally, Jesus is back in the center where he should have always been, but hasn't been until now. And he takes over. And with one word, Jesus casts out the demon. The boy is healed, and the people are amazed. And the days go on, and the crowds hang around waiting to hear more and to get more. But I'm sure the disciples were thinking, why couldn't we save that boy? Why couldn't we cast out that demon? We are Jesus' disciples, all of us. 3 of us hiked up with Jesus, and the rest of us who are down here casting out other demons and doing ministry. On the mountain, we were invincible. But down here, we're absolute failures. Every last one of us. So later on, verse 19, in private, because these things are embarrassing, they asked Jesus about what happened. Why? What went wrong? What did we do wrong? And Jesus' answer is a shock. He says, because you don't have enough faith. In Mark and Luke, it says, you didn't pray. After all they had seen, after all they had experienced, they had simply assumed that they could invoke Jesus' power whenever they pleased. Jesus wasn't in the center. He was off to the sideline. They were trying to take the forefront. It wasn't that they didn't have faith at all. They had some. It was just weak. Might have been strong enough to see the big things that God provided for them, like the transfiguration, but it was too small for the everyday issues of life. But that's exactly where they and where we need to have faith the most. Not to see the big things of God, but to live the things of God in the mundane areas of our lives. Having faith is tough, and it's even more difficult to live it out and allow it to grow. And if you have the strength and the guts to hike with Jesus, you will find it tested and pushed and stretched as you make your journey. There are 4 places where your faith will be tested. And those 4 places are the same places where a hiker must go if he or she wants to reach the summit. The climb up. The climb up is hard work, and you need to have faith enough in yourself and in the journey to keep going. Going up, you will discover exactly how out of shape you really are, physically and spiritually. In order to reach the summit, you have to fight off the temptation to quit and never reach the top. You must resist the desire to take long pauses. You mustn't allow yourself to get distracted by the beauty around you, which may all look very nice, but it gets very easy to become satisfied with where you are and drop out of the climb. It happens on your journey with Jesus. If this happens on your journey with Jesus, you will never reach the place that he's planned for you. That's the place where he's building your spiritual resilience. It's on the hard climb up. Jesus is also there, and your faith will be tested on the summit. Now, the summit is very cool. Any of you who are into mountain climbing knows that the summit is very cool. It does really feel like you are on top of the world. Yes, you still feel the ache in your legs and you're breathing, you're still heavy, but you feel suddenly energized, like you could just walk down and climb up another 5 mountains before the day is over. Spiritually for us, these are camps and congresses, conferences like this, church retreats, youth gatherings, anywhere you feel like this is it. This is where I'm meeting God. And I love the summit. But I know that I can't stay up there forever. I don't actually grow or develop my skills on the summit. I don't build resilience at all on the summit. I get inspired at the summit. And this is where our faith is challenged. There comes a time when you and I must start the trip back down. And that's where our faith is tested the 3rd time. It's the long walk down. The journey off the mountain is actually more dangerous than the journey up. Because you have now hiked, in our case, we had already hiked 8 hours. And although you feel elated, your body is tired. And it often leads to making mistakes, and they can be costly mistakes. Walking down the mountain takes a lot more faith because mostly you know what you're leaving behind, but also you know what you're going back down to. And it's not always pleasant. You must face the same temptations you faced on your journey upwards, but this time, there's no excitement of the summit to keep you moving. You risk injury by going too quickly and getting out of control, and if you go too slow, you risk walking in the dark. 1 foot in front of the other, walk down is a steady, slow pace. Watch for hazards on the path, keep hydrated, allow yourself to reflect on what you saw at the summit, and before long, you're back at the base, back on flat ground. When we read the Gospels, we find that Jesus had very few mountaintop experiences. We mostly find Jesus in the villages, in the cities, in the middle of crowds, having meals, going to parties, talking with those who were lonely, healing the sick, touching the untouchables, teaching those who wanted to learn, and confronting those who didn't. And this is where we live. We don't live on the mountain. We live on flat ground. Because this is where people need us. This is where they need the church the most, is in the daily routines of their lives. They need us in the daily grind of daily living, where finances are limited, where children get sick, where people, including children and almost certainly teenagers, don't trust each other and are prisoners to fear. They need us in the confusion of conflicting ideas and choices, mixed messages and new truths. They need us when there's suffering and abuse and abandonment. This is where we live most often and where our faith is pushed to its limits. It's when we're doing our shopping and we travel to and from work, and as we're at work, and as we stand in lines, go to the cinema and sit on the beach. It's in all of these places that the world needs to see and feel our living faith. They need to see hope and kindness, love and gentleness. They need to see power that comes from an unquenchable source of faith in Jesus Christ, who defeated death, rose victorious, and who again lives in glorified perfection. This is life. This is where we live. In all four of those places, Jesus is with us. Jesus didn't meet Peter, James, and John on top of the mountain, and he didn't suddenly appear with them at the bottom. Jesus walked up with them, and he walked down with them. He shared the summit experience with them. And Jesus invites us to walk this journey with him every step of the way. As we walk up, he's the one urging us to take another step. Don't give up. Don't turn back. But dream and imagine what the summit will be. And he's there with us again right at the summit, showing us what we can be and how good things can look. At the summit, he allows us to rest, to slow down, and to enjoy his presence. Often he whispers his dreams for us in those moments. Sometimes we can barely hear them, but we get a quick glimpse of what our lives could be, and it's great. But then he reminds us it's time to go back down, and our lives must be lived where he has placed us. For some of us, Jesus walks down beside us and helps us understand what we've learned from the journey up and at the summit. For others, he goes slightly ahead, and he prepares the path, making sure that the dangers are out of the way. And still others, or maybe for all of us at some point in our journey, he goes well in front of us, and he allows us to crash into him because we're too afraid to take another step. He's never far away, he's never distracted, and his goal is to get us down safely. And so there he is again, right beside us on the ground, living with us. He goes to school with you. He sits in your classroom with you. He is everywhere with you, and he wants to help you through making decisions, whether you change jobs or get married, having children, doing his work, living and dying, always, all the time, Jesus is there. Will we make mistakes? Yes. Will we fail? Probably. Will Jesus give up on us? Never. Jesus didn't give up on his disciples. He just asked them to keep walking. Keep walking in your faith. Keep trying to understand who he is and what he came to do. That's what Jesus asks of you and I as well. Missional living, transformational living, being disciples, is about staying on the journey with Jesus, no matter where you are on that journey. If you're at the top of the mountain, rejoice in it. Live it. Get the most out of that moment. When you're here, enjoy it. Don't feel guilty about it. Refuse to think of the journey back down, because that is in 2 days. Now, enjoy it. Embrace it. If you're climbing up or crawling down, don't give up. Let Jesus teach you what you need to learn for the next stage. Just keep moving. And if you're at the bottom and living in the daily grind, don't stop. Put everything that you learned, saw, and experienced this weekend and other weekends and days that you have, put that experience into action. Encourage those who are tired, feed those who are hungry, share the hope with those who are desperate, give money to those who are needy, Work ethically where there are no ethics at all. Raise your children, love your spouse where families are falling apart, and do it all with Jesus right in the center of your heart, your thoughts, your decisions, and your life. So as I come to the application bit, I said in the first section that I was going to talk about Jesus being undercover for 30 years. And he was. We know that he didn't start his public ministry until he was about 30. What was he doing those 30 years? The Bible doesn't say, so everything we're about to say is conjecture. And I think there's wisdom in this room, so I think our conjecture won't be, crazy. But let's not be afraid to imagine what Jesus might have been doing. Now, we do have some clues to some of the things he was doing. We know, for example, that when he was 12, he stayed in Jerusalem studying the scriptures and asking questions. So in the next just couple of minutes, yell out, what do you think he was doing what he was doing? And this is not a test. There will not be grades for us. No one will fail. That's the famous lines that my son lives for. What was Jesus doing? What do you think he was doing? 30 years.
Well, working as a carpenter.
Yeah, carpentry, definitely. You all know his dad was a carpenter. That's what kids did back then. Followed their dads if they were boys.
With difficult customers.
Yes, oh, indeed. Yeah, there's a man who's worked in business. Dealt with difficult customers.
Going into the desert to pray.
Yeah. Okay.
Carrying out the Father's will in the daily grind.
Yeah. Or at least learning to do so.
Playing with his peers.
Yes. Remember, some of those 30 years, he would have been under 10.
Studying, learn and a skill.
Yeah. Yeah.
Being a son and a brother.
Exactly. All of those things. He worked with his dad, he made friends, he helped his mom, he learned from people, he watched society around him, and he didn't learn just from people, he learned people. He was an observer, I believe. He was the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Every person that was walking around, he had his little finger in their creation. And yet he had never seen humanity from a human point of view. So in his very, very early age, he had to allow somebody to change his nappy and clean him. Then he had to learn not to suck his thumb. All of these little details, the mundane things, which is a great word to use, all the mundane things that we do as people, Jesus did for the first 30 years. And obviously, Jesus in his perfection knew that 30 years was no more, no less what he needed to understand what it was like to be human, what we must feel like every single day when things go well, when things go bad, when that piece of furniture that you had been building for the last 4 weeks has a crack and it broke. He must have known what it felt like to hit his thumb with a hammer. He must have been irritated, and would Jesus roll his eyes? I don't know. But when his mom asked him to help clean the dishes, did he go, I don't know, but he probably had to do it. These are all really important things that you and I had to learn, and Jesus had to learn. So this is application number 1, prepare. You want to know how to maneuver in your schools and in your society? Prepare. Learn more about the issues that are around us. What are the burning issues in your school, in your family, in your society? If you have a paper, or if you're taking notes on your cell phone, or even if you just want to think about it, what are the hardest issues for you right now? For some of you, it's the LGBTQ+. For some of you, it's gender issues. For some of you, it's same-sex parents. For some of you, it's sexual promiscuity. For some of you, it is the rampant behavioral complications that this generation seems to show? Just write them down, identify them. They're scarier when they live in our head. Not so scary when they're on a piece of paper. And the reason I say that is because each one of them is researchable. And with a little bit of research, with a little bit of a term paper, you can get some really good ideas. This conference is brilliant. I'm staying tomorrow for the sessions because I want to learn. Because some of these are on my list as a pastor and as a leader of an alliance. Once you've identified your list, what are the parallel issues found in the Bible? The exact work we did with those four people, the centurion, the woman of the well, the leper, and Nicodemus. When you think of the LGBTQ+, the gender issues, same-sex marriage, what are the parallels? You will not find any of those labels in the Bible, by the way. But they all exist, and they all existed because Rome was weird. And they were incredibly permissive. So it all exists. So what are the parallels? What are the principles involved in dealing with the issue? The New Testament is full of brilliant concepts, not of how to deal with little Johnny, who has same-sex parents, but how to deal in society when families are separated or mixed up or dangerous. The Bible talks about that. Paul talks about it. Peter talks about it. Jesus talked about it. So Jesus at 30 is prepared. He took 30 years. As you read the gospel, does it appear to you that Jesus is lost? Or confused about where he's going or what he's doing? Do you think it was an accident that he ended up in Jerusalem that fateful week? Yeah, I don't think he was either. So that's application number 2. Have a plan. Not many of us can just come up with a brilliant or well thought through answer on the spot. We need to plan. You're all teachers. When you give your students a project, something to report on, do you expect them to research it and prepare it, or do you plan, or do you just want them to come up to the front and just, woo, whatever comes off the top of their head, let's go for it? No, you fail them, and you yell at them, and you think, uh-oh. And rightly so. Why is it different for us in society? I didn't go to the universities and talk about freedom of speech and freedom of religion and hate speech off the top of my head. I went into the European Union, I went into the United Nations, and I did my research. Then I went into the Bible. And just like I have for you, I had pages and pages and pages of manuscript notes that I spoke from. Because that's my plan. I know what I'm going to say. I know what my next point is. So have a plan. And if that plan is detailed enough, then other questions that are slightly different, you'll still be able to answer because you've got a plan. If you don't believe me, then please believe Professor and Apostle Peter, because he taught us to say, be prepared in season and out of season. So school is never out as a disciple of Jesus. We need to always be prepared. The third application is the same application Jesus had for his disciples when they couldn't cast out demons. And friends, we are dealing with a lot of demons. They might look like our students, but there is an evil power that is motivating them. Our fight is actually not against flesh and blood, Apostle Paul, but against the dark forces of this evil world. And so the third application is pray. Paul tells us to pray on all occasions with all types of prayer, never giving up. And he warns us to put on our full armor of God and stand our ground again, because your fight is not against flesh and blood, but against the evil forces of this dark world. So we need spiritual weapons for a spiritual battle that we do not fight. Like, isn't this crazy? We have all of this armor of protection. We do have the sword of the Spirit, but then what are we supposed to do with it? What does Paul say? So you can go into battle and cut their heads off? When you are fully dressed, and be prepared so that you may stand. Stand. Stand is not an aggressive position, but it's also not a weak position. It's a firm, convicted, confident position. You are fully dressed, you are fully armored, and no matter what comes at you, you will not fall. Why, Graham, do we not have to go into battle?
Because we fight from victory, not for victory.
Because the battle was won. It's done. Spoiler alert, again, Jesus wins, Satan has lost. It's done. We stand. Again, if you want more scripture on this, the book of Revelation. To he who overcomes, not to he who fights, not to he who destroys, but he who overcomes, he who has a firm stance and does not fall. The only way I know to do that is by prayer. Because this battle, which we do not fight, is also done on our knees, in humility, keeping Jesus in the center. And I say on our knees in humility, it's because sometimes we try to take our stand on our own. But we can't do this on our own. Only a foolish general would send out one soldier to face an army. Jesus sends us all out in an incredible troop called the church. So our churches need to be involved, and they need to pray for us, and we need to be humble enough to ask them to pray for us, and not generically. I am a pastor in a church just not far from here actually. And I love when people ask me to pray. I dislike it when that's where they stop. Can you pray for me? Yeah? How? Oh, I don't know, just that my day goes well. What are you dealing with? What do you want me to pray for? What do you want your church to pray for? I am struggling with this. This is happening in my school. Obviously, you can't mention children's names. But can we pray for them specifically so we know what this might feel? Because usually when somebody tells me, I'm really struggling with a child in my classroom because they're acting out, and then actually today, social services came in, and this is a true story, social services came in and took him away. Nobody knows where he is, but we just found out his father has been abusing him for years. Now that, when I'm told that, I stop praying generically. And I start praying for what? For that little boy, for his mom, for his little sister. Who else? For all the kids sitting around him who are traumatized because a little boy was just taken out and nobody knows where he is, and they're his friends and they don't know. And I pray for his teacher who knows all too much but can't say a thing, so she or he struggles and suffers by themselves in silence, in agony, wondering, why didn't I know? Didn't I see it? I was mad at him the other day, and maybe it was just because. Oh, we need to pray, and I need it that specific as your pastor. It's not that Jesus doesn't know, because he knows every single detail, and he knows exactly where that little boy is, and I trust that that little boy is safe. But what we need to do is enter into each other's lives a little bit more. We should be crying with you as pastors and as church members, and you should be crying with us. We have to be careful what we share for confidentiality, but let's pray real prayers. So ask your churches to pray for you, not generically. Give them prayer requests. Be specific. The Holy Spirit can protect you and clear the atmosphere and do miracles. It's the same Holy Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. Do you really think he can't help you fix your classroom? Do you think he's powerless in your classroom? He is not. That little child that is driving you up the wall is intimately and preciously loved by Jesus. He had a finger in his creation. So he's not a pain. He's not a disaster. He's a diamond in the rough. Who maybe you were the only teacher to say to him, "It was great having you in class today." My son Caleb, who is a difficult child, didn't fall from nowhere. He had a difficult mother, who her school career, oh yes, and I am the mother. I had a difficult school career. I was smart, but I was naughty. And I was convinced that I was just a bad person. I'm also dyslexic, which means that I couldn't write. And when I was in grade 1, I had a teacher say to me, "Connie, you have the most mistakes on your spelling test. So you need to come up to the chalkboard." Back then they used chalk, do you remember all that? "And I want you to write out 10 times every word that you got wrong." There were 30 words, and I got 25 of them wrong. Halfway through, she said to me, "Go sit down, you're wasting our time. You're just not smart." And then she said in front of the class, "You are actually dumb." And until I was in grade 5, I was thoroughly convinced that I was dumb. And so I behaved like a dumb person behaves, and I was hilarious, but I did bad in all of my subjects because I was dumb. And then in grade 5, Mr. Parks. It's amazing how you remember the names. Mr. Parks, in my science class, was helping me with an experiment, and he looked at me. He wasn't even my teacher was gone. He was a substitute from the other side, from a different class, and he came over and he said, "Connie, you were very smart, and I believe in you, and I don't think I need to help you with the experiment. You've got this." And you know what? I believed him too. And I went on to be an A+ student, leaving college with a 3.98 average out of 4. That's the power that you hold as teachers. It takes one word. How long did it take for Mr. Parks to say, "Connie, you're very smart and I believe in you"? That is less than 5 seconds, and he changed my world. What words can you say to the confused and the heartbroken? Just, maybe I'm here for you, I care for you. Glad you're in my class. You were really disruptive today, but it would have been boring without you. Be creative. Be creative. But it could be that one phrase that makes that little boy or that little girl say, "I am not the disaster that you all keep insisting that I am." And maybe they get it from home. So I'm going to leave you with one more application that Jesus taught, and it holds true also for hiking. Never hike or follow Jesus alone. It's dangerous and difficult. It's a cardinal rule, actually, of hiking. You always hike in groups. And the reason for that are obvious and many. So about being disciples, just never do it alone. While our decision to follow Jesus is an individual one, our living it is corporate and communal. We walk together, we build strong networks of support and encouragement, and even a little bit of exhortation and correction. You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light on a hill. How will you plan and prepare for that? Who will you ask to pray with you and for you? And what do you want them to pray for? We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to stop. And I would like you, again, to get into groups, maybe a bit smaller than some of them. And I want you to share your thoughts. And I want you to share specific prayer requests with one another. And don't leave this room without having on that piece of paper or on your cell phone, when you get home, who will you ask to pray for you? And some specific requests that you will tell your church about, to make sure that from here, as we walk either onto the flat ground or start going up the hill or needing to come down, that you are safe, protected, and hopeful. Prepare, make a plan, and pray.